I'm photographer David duChemin, and this is Vision is Better, a sometimes weekly podcast about the craft and art of photography. Welcome here. Hey everybody, welcome to another edition, another episode of Vision is Better. Last week I talked about the power of constraints in the creative process, and I thought rather than kind of leave it as it was, I thought I would explain a little bit more using some photographs from the last couple of months in Europe, because I think if we can wrap our brains around this idea of creative constraints and how powerful they can be in the process of being creative, and if we can get away from the idea and the fear that you might miss a shot. Of course you'll miss a shot. You'll always miss shots. So what's important is not the shots you miss. What's important is the shots you get. And the photographs that you make using the idea of creative constraints are often, or at least for me, they are the best ones, because the constraints get me onto a path of being more creative and seeing things in a way that I might not have seen them. So I'm going to turn my attention to the screen flow here and turn it on, and I'll walk you through a couple of photographs. All right, so this is just a collection that I've created in Lightroom, and I know that probably made you dizzy and sick. Sorry, but I want to talk a little bit about the constraints, and I want to talk a little bit about them in terms of not only the constraints I used and where they led me to in one body of work, but how they kind of were instrumental in getting me to where I was at the end of a body of work. So I started with these first images here. These here are from London, and they were just made with my iPhone and a simple filter that I added after the fact in a app called Light, I think. And mostly I was just playing with it. It was a new app to me. And the idea started out with architectural elements taking up a geometric space within the frame. And so the first image is of one of the bridges. I don't think it's Millennium Bridge. London's so new to me. I haven't been there for 15 years, and all this stuff is new. But I rather than capture this broad, epic kind of picture of London with these elements in, I sort of started thinking about how could I isolate bits of geometry. And so that was my constraint. And you'll see that in the first three images. It kind of morphs in this next image, and I started playing with reflections. Down to this fifth image, I'm still working on architectural details, but the reflections are taking over. And by the time I get here to this image of St. Paul's, the idea of reflections is what is really grabbing my imagination and my curiosity. So it's not really, in this case, it's not really specifically about architectural detail. It started there, but it got me to this more interesting place. Now, if we go to my larger sort of collection here, that was London. And once I got to Paris and I got my Fuji out and I started playing, these photographs are an extension of these. They're a different body of work, but I've included them here for the sake of the podcast. But the idea of reflections, as I was thinking about it, and my creative process is fairly introspective. I'm always thinking about how I can do it better, what my frustrations are. I'm looking at my work and saying, is this taking me in a direction I didn't expect? And it did, in fact, because I started thinking not just about reflections, but about shadows. Part of that is the constraint that nature gave me. I was out photographing at a time of day where the shadows were one of the prominent products of the light. And I started to direct my attention there. And usually where there are great shadows, there can be great reflections. And there can be great, if you shoot against the light, there can be great silhouettes. And so that became, as you see as I start scrolling through, that became my guiding constraint. Of course, I'm not completely limited by it. There was stuff that I photographed throughout this trip that had nothing to do with shadows, reflections, or silhouettes. But when I was out photographing and I was out, looking for the magic, the thing that helped keep my eyes open to the magic was this idea of the constraints of reflection and shadow and silhouette. And so you see it expressed in different ways. Here's some great shadows and colors. And so I started playing with colors. And at a certain point, and it was back here when I started playing with shadows, that I realized that if I shot everything on my Fuji with the Velvia film emulation active, that I would get much deeper, richer shadows. And I always prefer to do things in camera if I can. It's not a religion for me, but I prefer it because I can see the results so immediately. I don't have to bring them into Photoshop or an iPhone app to play with them. So I set my camera to the Fuji, I set my Fuji camera to the Velvia film emulation, which gives me dark, rich shadows. I'm not afraid to plunge them into black. I often underexposed my images by a stop or two to enhance both the colors and the reflections and the shadows. So I'm telling you all that so you understand how the creative process works, and it's very iterative. It moves from one thing to another. Here we're in Venice, and I'm starting to shoot against glass and find reflections there. I'm starting to play with some of the reflections in the water, and that led to some really fun stuff. Images that I don't have here, but really enjoyed just playing with the abstracts. The best expression of which was probably this one here, where one of the hotels in the background was yellow with an Italian flag, which you can see here reflected in the water, and there's some reds and blues, and the whole hotel was yellow, and of course the sky reflected in the glossy black of the gondolas. That was probably one of the better examples of my playing around with, but my eyes were opened to these possibilities because of the constraints. And I guess I'm telling you all of this so you see the freedom that comes from constraints, not the limitations that come from constraints, which is what we too often think about. We too often think that if I pick a constraint, I'm going to miss something, when in fact, this opened my eyes to more possibilities than it might have otherwise. Otherwise, I may have just been wandering around looking for something and never seeing anything. This is Rome now, and you see shadows here, you see reflections here, and some of the stuff doesn't work. Here I'm back to the idea of small architectural elements. I mean, you could argue that the bird is a silhouette, but that's pushing it. This is off-brand for this particular exercise, but it will match fairly nicely with these previous images from London, or it might. So a constraint isn't there to limit you and restrict you. A constraint is actually there to free you up. And so this is the kind of stuff, this image here, this is not particularly, there's no silhouette, there's no shadow, and there's no reflection per se, other than you could argue that in the mirror. But I'm not trying that hard. I don't need to force this. The point is not that this necessarily works with this greater body of work. The point in this case is that it got me to photographing this. And I will fit this in either with this whole series, and I'm not going to call it reflections and shadows or something like that. It may be that the focus is just moments that are bright, saturated colors with heavy shadows, and the whole thing holds together with the being visually unified by those aspects, the heavy shadows and the dark blacks and the really cool colors. And by cool, I mean the really interesting colors, not temperature cool. And it eventually led me to this last image, which I may in the end convert to black and white. I'm not so big on bright, hot pink, which this Dirty Dancing poster is. But I loved the juxtaposition here. You got this really friendly old guy. He smiled at me when I stuck my camera up at the window, and he's got these pinup girls here reflected. And there was something really great about this that I never would have imagined that I would have got to by starting over here. So it's the creative process that I want to focus on. It's the idea that when you start with a constraint, when you start with with a starting point, rather than giving yourself this analysis paralysis and not sure which lens, which thing do I shoot, you pick a constraint and let it guide you either to the magic or to a point at which you find something else. I jumped off from say, for example, this photograph. You would never imagine that it would lead to this photograph, nor that it would in the end go all the way to this photograph. That's a long way away from the work that I started with. But the point again is not that you stick to your guns. The point is that you engage in a process that gets you to photographing things that you find exciting, and maybe pushing some of those other decisions that you might have to make. Do I use a wide angle lens? Well, if you've restricted yourself to only using a 70 to 200 millimeter, the answer is no. And now you can focus on the best expression of the scene in front of you with that lens, and it opens you to new things. That's what creativity is about. That's why I'm so big on the idea of understanding and harnessing the creative process, because I really truly believe that if we understand it, we will become more creative photographers. Not creative for the sake of being creative, but creative for the sake of making better photographs. Thanks so much for joining me. Please leave comments in the comment field if there's something that you feel I haven't explained really well, and we'll kind of carry on the conversation that way, or it'll lead to another episode. If you haven't already, please subscribe. Thanks so much for joining me. Remember, gear is good, but vision's better. See you next time.